Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing well, thank you very much. And I'm so excited because we're on part 4 of our story tonight. It's the final part of our story, and we're going to hear all about what's really going on at the Grey Lady. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and I always appreciate your comments after a good story. So I really hope you enjoy this because I know I'm going to. So let's continue with our story. Paul Benelodge's account. I knew when both Bart and Michael came to see me, wearing on their forlorn faces expressions incredibly solemn, that I knew something profound had happened to the both of them. My heart did a belly flop. What was it they wanted to convey to me, I wondered. I was not sure that I actually wanted to hear what they had to say. Both of the men began to tell me almost at once how they decided to investigate the woodgrove. They wanted to find out why they could not shake off the hauntingly airy feeling that they were being watched all the time, which was an experience all had encountered working at the Grey Lady. I must confess, Mr. Benelodge, it was bothering me significantly, Michael confessed to me. I mean, every time I've been out of my truck, having a smoke, something's been watching us. I could feel it to the core of my bones, and so could Bart. So I persuaded him to just go and look in the grove, to see if our fears of being watched were unfounded. I mean, the trees themselves look like sinister humanoid monsters, do they not? We were wondering if perhaps they were the cause of this discombobulating feeling we were experiencing. Or was some vagrant camping out in the grove and spying on us, which we both gleamed was also a possibility. We went into the grove, and although it was dark and dingy, it was relatively benign in there, until of course we encountered what I can only describe as a gnarled-looking tree, decorated with bones that had been inauspiciously tied onto the branches like Christmas decorations. And let's just say, the macabre sight was more than a little discomposing. It rarely spooked the both of us. I hasten to say the tree was located in an area of the grove that was unnervingly quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. So it set our nerves on edge. You couldn't hear any bird song in there, and that part of the grove was as lifeless as a parched desert. It was awful, Mr. Benelodge, Bart agreed. You got a sense you were being told to stay the hell away. I promise you, the moment I saw the tree with the bones hanging on it, I got the message loud and clear. Worse still, the grove stank of decomposing flesh that burnt the back of my eyes and my throat. It was very unpleasant. It made me want to gag and be violently sick. We both heard a bleating sound, and I discovered little Bambi lying in this ugly nest, made out of twigs and grass, filled with bones. Huge it was. One of those bones was a human skull. What? I said, my slouched, relaxed posture becoming as straight as a pencil. Are you sure it was a human skull? I asked. Could you not have been mistaken? This, I knew, was not good news. It might mean I had to call the police, and that was the last thing we needed on this property. Crime scene tape everywhere. Police crawling around the place like a long line of carpenter ants. Beyond all that, it could postpone the refurbishing of the property, and that would be a very significant setback. We're sure, said Michael soberly. It was definitely a human skull, I'm afraid. There is more to the story, said Bart pensively, looking from both me to Michael with an awkward uncomfortableness, as if he was rather reluctant to share something with us. I didn't tell you this, Michael. I'm not sure why, but I guess I'm just trying to process this all in my head. But I think I know who the nest belongs to, and who hung all those bones over the tree branches, and who also was responsible for putting little Bambi in his nest to eat later as a snack." "Who?" asked Michael, looking confounded. "Did you see something, Bart, when we were in the wood grove? I knew you were acting funny when we reunited Bambi with his mother. I knew you were hiding something. What the hell did you see? Spill it, for goodness sake." "I did see something," Bart admitted. "I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I thought you'd seen it too, when we were walking through the trees. I was carrying Bambi in my arms, holding him close to my chest. You were leading the way through the trees, Michael. I was walking behind you. I turned around to look over my shoulders for a brief second, and that was when I saw him. He was a huge dog man, standing there between the trees, watching me. I swear this thing was laughing at us, cocking its head from side to side, wobbling unsteadily on its feet, as though intoxicated. This thing was getting off on our fear, Michael. I know it was. It was the most gruesome creature I have ever beheld. The hair on the back of my arms was standing up on end. You're lucky, bro, you didn't see it. But are you sure you saw a dogman? Could you not have been mistaken?" asked Michael. "I'm absolutely sure," said Bart. "This thing was hell of a scary. It was laughing at me." "I don't know what to say," said Michael. "I guess it explains a whole lot." "You're going to have to take me to the nest before we call the police," I told both of my men. "I need to see the nest for myself and observe the human skull that you're talking about." "But we don't want to go in there again, Mr. Benelodge," said Bart. "What if the dog man comes after us? This thing is predatory, dangerous. There was a skull in the nest, a human skull, I promise you. Take my word for it. Just call the police and be done with it." "I'm afraid, Bart, I cannot do that, until I'm fully satisfied that there is indeed a human skull in the nest you saw. Rest assured, we will go in the grove together fully armed for our protection. But you do need to show me where the nest is." I decided not to tell both men about two women from the past who resided at the Grey Lady, who had supposedly gone missing over the years, believed to have been abducted and killed by a dogman. Some things were best not shared, especially now when both Bart and Michael were in a fragile state of mind. I did not need them falling apart on me or abandoning our work at the Grey Lady. Both Michael and Bart did not need their feathers more shaken than they already were. Ostensibly, both these men were not the kind of people given to being rattled so easily. I knew that Bart had seen something. Regretfully, both men were exceedingly reluctant to go into the grove, but I had to find the nest they'd seen, and I persuaded them to oblige my request, and thank God I did, for I would have looked foolish if I had called the police. Bart was acting very fearful, looking around all the time like a frightened kid, so I felt rather bad dragging him into the woods again, but it just could not be helped. "That's the tree over there, Mr. Benelodge," said Michael, pointing it out to me. But as we got closer to the crooked-looking tree, both men appeared rather bewildered and nonplussed. Bart was pointing at the tree with widened eyes. "But I don't understand, Mr. Benelodge. The tree was covered with bones, I promise you it was. But they've been removed. There were tons of bones on this tree. Now they've gone." "But are you sure you've pointed out the correct tree to me?" I asked them. They both nodded. "But what about the nest? Whereabouts is that?" "It's over here," said Michael, beckoning for me to follow him. I crawled behind some thorny briars at the back of the gnarled tree, and that was when Michael pointed to a barren patch of ground under the tree, bespeckled with a few stray leaves, but nothing was there. His face grew astonishingly white. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Where is the nest?" That's it. It's gone. It's vanished. The space has been cleared up. A moment ago it was there, I promise you. We're not making this up, Mr. Benelodge. I think the dogman that Bart saw got rid of all the evidence. We cannot call the police now. There's nothing to see. We'll look like complete imbeciles. Oh, officer, there's a skull in a nest, but it's gone. They'll probably think we're smoking weed. You're right, I told them. We can't possibly call the police without incriminating evidence. They'll think we're 3 sheets to the wind. But for the record, I believe your story. I do think the nest belonged to a dogman. And by the sounds of things, he's an emotionally intelligent and very clever creature. Shrewd enough to cover up his tracks after you discovered his nest. That's clever for sure. So you believe us? Asked Bart, looking surprised. I mean, this is a beast that most would call mythical. And you believe our account? If the boot were on the other foot, Mr. Benelodge, I'm not sure I would believe you. Of course I believe you. And I will tell you one day why I do. I told the men, but now is not the time to share such things with you. You can take the rest of the day off work. You have both had quite a shock. I need you back at work in the morning, bright and early. Understood? Both men nodded appreciatively, sauntering off to their trucks, glad to finally get off the property. I could tell they'd been significantly rattled. This was a morning they would unlikely ever forget. But I realized it was exceedingly helpful that they'd encountered a dogman. It would seem an unorthodox creature from the past was still loitering around the wood grove. Could its negative energy be impacting the Grey Lady? While I collected my thoughts together, I decided what needed to be done. The first thing I would do was to call Lizelle Peterson, inform her on what my men had uncovered, and what I believed we should do about the problem. Lizelle's account. I was excited about the transformations that were taking place on the Grey Lady, that I'd purchased for me and my husband. The house would ultimately one day become our family home, where we would raise our children. I knew in no uncertain terms that the mansion which I chose to call the Grey Lady would metamorphosize into a goddess once she was brought back to her former glory. The tragedy was that my husband failed to see the potential of the Grey Lady. She was more than just a house to me. From the moment I laid eyes on the house, I felt a need to rescue her from her lugubrious melancholia. I believed restoring her to her former glory would do just that. I thought my husband Roland would see the Grey Lady through my discerning eyes, but his reaction to the house hit a raw nerve for me. I was bitterly disappointed to see that he obviously hated the place with a burning passion, as if he couldn't even bear to look at it. Lizelle, sweetheart, I told you you could choose where you'd like us to live, he said to me coyly. But I'm sorry, this house you have chosen. I don't know what to say. I was not expecting this. It's a little like having an 18-year-old daughter, asking me to meet her fiancé for the very first time, and then I discover she's fallen madly in love with a very decrepit, cantankerous old man. I wouldn't be pleased with her choice, just like I'm not very pleased with your choice right now, Lizelle. This house. Oh, I don't know what to say. How can you describe the Grey Lady like this? In my opinion, she's like a woman in mourning. I agree her energy is rather heavy at the moment. But don't you see it's because she's been neglected for so long? Once we give her a facelift, you'll barely recognise her. Well, I hope you're right, sweetheart, said Roland, sweeping me lovingly into his arms. I do hope you're right. I'm not sure that you are. I wonder, once the house has been gutted and refurbished, will the energy actually shift? That's what I'd like to know. But of course it will. Don't be so negative, I said. Think about it, Roland. If you were a street urchin lying on the street, scrambling around for scraps, wearing shabby clothes and covered in dirt, you're going to look pretty miserable, aren't you? But when you're nicely cleaned up with a new set of clothes and a bath, you're going to be a happy camper, aren't you? It's the same for the Grey Lady." "But is it? Supposing the street urchin you're talking about is still miserable, in his own skin, or her skin if you like, after her makeover. It could be the same for this house, even when you bring it back into shape. Who's to say that the dark energy will actually shift?" "But of course it will," I said, but my words began to lack confidence, because my husband's clawing, sticky words had hit a raw nerve. What if he was right? And after the renovations of the Grey Lady, she continued to look so oppressively gloomy. Then all my dreams for the place would go up in a pillar of smoke. Imagine my surprise when a couple of months after Mr. Benelodge's team was working hard on renovating the Grey Lady, I got a phone call from him. He was managing the restoration project of my home. He insisted on seeing me at once, as he had something urgently important to convey to me. So I dropped everything I was doing and hurried over to the Grey Lady. And when I saw Paul Benelodge, I knew what he had to say was profound, and it definitely concerned the property that I'd purchased. "We have a problem, Mrs. Peterson," he told me. "A problem? What kind of problem?" I asked him. "Brace yourself, Mrs. Peterson. This is not going to be easy to hear." "You're scaring me, Mr. Benelodge. Please tell me, what's going on? You're freaking me out." "Fair enough. I will cut to the chase, Mrs. Peterson. There is no easy way to tell you this, but 2 of my men working on the restoration project of your home have seen a dogman in the woods on your property. They found a nest with a human skull in it." "What?" I gasped, throwing my hands over my mouth and staring at Mr. Benelodge with wide, startled eyes. "You're joking?" I asked. "I wish I was joking, Mrs. Peterson, but I'm afraid I'm not. Of course, when I went investigating into the woodgrove myself to find the nest, it had mysteriously just vanished, as had the human skull, which in a way is a very good thing, as the police cannot be involved any more. But that skull could have been someone's loved one. But it will never be found now, because the nest is no longer there. But let me tell you, it must have belonged to the dogman that one of my men saw." "So your man saw a dogman? The same as the 2 families that lived at the Grey Lady? They also witnessed dogmen from the past, remember?" "I'm afraid so, Mrs. Peterson. You know the dogman stories are related to the history of the Grey Lady, where 2 women were clearly snatched by a dogman, fitting the description of the creature that my man saw. I imagine the story has been controversial over the years. Many people in North America believe that this creature is a mythical beast. Not so, Mrs. Peterson. These things appear to rarely exist. I assure you both my men are reliable witnesses. As I was saying, it was Bart who saw the dogman in detail. He knows what he saw, and he is one of the most level-headed people I know, so I completely trust his account. He'd never make a fictitious story up like this. Furthermore, Bart has not been influenced by the history of this property, for he knows nothing of it. I do not know what this dogman is doing on the premises, Mrs. Peterson, but I do know this. We need answers. I propose we get a psychic medium to visit the Grey Lady, to give us her take on what is going on here. I personally do not understand any of this, but I will say one thing unequivocally, Mrs. Peterson, so I'm not going to mince my words. I believe this dogman imposes a very real threat to you and your husband. Such a beast destroyed 2 families living on this property. I would not want it to destroy both you and your husband, Roland. I could not live with myself if history repeated itself again, which is bound to happen if we don't get answers to this problem and reach a solution to deal with this dogman in some way." "But I don't know what to say, Mr. Benelodge. It never occurred to me. that such a beast would still be around after all these years. People have lived and died on this property, and he's still around. It makes no sense. I'm completely confounded. How does that even happen? I feel as if the breath has been sucked out of my lungs, almost as if I've been flung into an alternative reality. I mean, all this stuff about cryptic creatures, it's so outlandishly bizarre. But I believe you, Mr. Benelodge. I really do believe that everything you've said is absolutely correct. And you're right, we need help. And a psychic medium would be a good start, as such a person might proficiently see through the muddy layers of our confusion, the things that we obviously can't see, the things beyond our grasp and comprehension.
My thoughts exactly. And I know exactly who to contact, Mrs. Peterson, you'll be glad to know. I've been working with old historic homes for quite some time. This is not the first time I have called on the services of a psychic medium. I will be contacting a woman called Yvonne McBride. She really knows her stuff. In a nutshell, I think she will be able to explain exactly what's going on here. Her spirit guides will give her the answers we are seeking. Of that I am most sure.
I was amazed when the psychic medium Yvonne McBride arrived at the premises with a Native American shaman at her side. Both me and Mr. Benelodge had not anticipated she would bring a shaman with her. Yvonne McBride was a small woman in stature. She was about 4 foot 2 inches tall, with a crop of grey short hair and brown lively eyes that danced with merriment, but at the very same time she seemed very serious in regards to the matter at hand. She was wearing a cashmere sweater in a pale, barely pink colour, with a grey pair of trousers that flared at the bottom and brushed against her slim ankles. The Native American shaman was surprisingly dressed like your average American man, wearing a mustard-coloured pair of chinos and a loose white cotton tunic. But when I saw him, I could almost imagine him, out on the open American plains, galloping on the back of a powerful jet-black stallion, wearing a magnificent full headdress of eagle's feathers. I noticed the shaman was wearing an interesting stone pendant around a very sturdy large neck. He had very noble-looking features, including prominent high cheekbones, and a powerful-looking chin. His weathered, well-lined skin was as warm as a chestnut, and he looked as if he didn't belong in civilian American clothes. One look at his brown hooded eyes, I knew this man was deeply spiritual. I instinctively perceived he could see things that others clearly could not. Our visitors at first did not greet me or poor Benelodge. They got out of their truck rather gingerly, as if focusing on their immediate environment, studying everything with a keen intrigue. I stood in the doorway of the Grey Lady with poor Benelodge at my side. We stood there watching our visitors with a curious interest. In truth, it felt like both Yvonne McBride and the shaman had not even noticed we were actually there. It was like they were looking beyond the Grey Lady, seeing things that Paul and I were not privy to actually seeing. I was almost dreading what they would ultimately tell me. For a long time the shaman and the psychic stared at the Grey Lady, and then at the grove of trees. They looked at the trees for a very long time. They then locked eyes with each other, in some kind of telepathic exchange, and nodded. They proceeded to walk towards our front door, and that was when they both nodded at both me and Paul Benelodge, in a friendly greeting. "You must be Mrs. Peterson," said Yvonne MacLeod, reaching out to take my hand in hers. "That's right," I said, shaking her hand and offering her a somewhat watery smile. "This is Mr. Benelodge. He's in charge of the restoration project here at the Grey Lady. He was the one that suggested I called you. I'm very glad you've come along. The workers on the property have experienced strange things around here, I'm afraid. We're wondering what your take on all of it is, which is why we called you out here. People working on the premises feel they're being watched all the time by something rather malevolent in the grove, and in the house itself there's been cold spots and the sound of a woman weeping." "That does not surprise me in the slightest, Mrs. Peterson. Let's just say there's been a lot of grief spent at this house. It's quite palpable, you know. You do realize, Mrs. Peterson, that the house itself reached out to you in person to save it." "Really? But why would it do that?" Well, something about you resonated with it, I suspect. The original owner of this house, long since deceased, reached out to you from beyond the grave, believed you could negate the bad energy here. Your buying the property, Mrs. Peterson, was no accident. Contrary to popular belief, even accidents are sometimes pre-planned, you know, before we actually make our incarnation on this earth. Oh, do mind my manners. I get so carried away sometimes. I've not been to a property like yours for many years. The sorrowful energy here cuts you to the quick like a knife. Everything is tragically affected by the energy here, which can drag you right down and bring on dreadful feelings of fatigue. My name is Yvonne McBride, and this is Hawkeye. He's a Native American shaman, she told us. I brought him here because my guides informed me he would be very much needed in this venture. Hawkeye understands energy vortexes and meridians and portals and stuff like that on the land. My guides always give me judicious seasoned advice, you see, before I agree to take on a project. I would never have come here if I hadn't felt obliged to do so. You do need help, or you could potentially be in very grave danger, Mrs. Peterson, I hate to tell you. You do realize there's an interdimensional portal in your woods that has to be closed. Things are coming out of that portal, very bad things. One of them has been feeding on the fear he engenders among his victims. You see, Mrs. Peterson, some negative entities get their food from our fear, from our grief, helplessness, and despair. I had not told Yvonne MacLeod anything about what was going on the property, so I was completely nonplussed by what she was telling me. It was starting to make a whole lot of sense. We need to go around the premises, she told me, and then we will tell you about what we've gleaned from everything. Hawkeye simply nodded at us and said nothing at all. Yvonne MacBride and Hawkeye walked around the property together. I couldn't keep my eyes off the both of them. I stood in the upstairs main bedroom, watching them through the glass pane of one of the windows, and that was when I saw a flash of something moving through the woods. It was so fleeting, but I knew at once I'd seen the dogman. I sensed it was upset that I had brought these people here to the Grey Lady, courtesy of Paul Benelodge. I felt certain that good was going to come from this experience, and we would ultimately be rid of the loathsome creature for good. For me, seeing the beast happen so very fast that my first thought was, did I actually see that? And I began to doubt that I had. Before long, I was in the kitchen, bustling around with a kettle, while Hawkeye was beginning to draw pictures on a paper pad he'd brought along with him. He laid down the pictures on the table, for both me and Mr. Benelodge to inspect. 2 were pictures of women. One woman was clearly wearing 1800s clothes. I was sure it was a picture of Eleanor Bennet, who had been carried away by a dogman in the 1800s, if the stories were to be believed, that is. The other picture was of Molly Sinclair, from the 1950s. Of that I was in no doubt, as I had seen a picture of her before. Molly Sinclair was also believed to have been abducted by a dogman-like creature. Imagine my shock when the shaman presented me a picture of the dogman. My blood grew as cold as ice, as that was the creature I was sure I'd seen from the upstairs window, only moments before, with the body almost of a human, covered in hair, and the head of a wolf. I physically began to shake, while my blood grew as cold as ice. Yvonne MacLeod reached out to squeeze my hand. "Are you all right, dear? You've gone terribly white." "It's just a lot to take in, that's all. These pictures that Hawkeye has drawn make everything seem so dreadfully real." "I can imagine, my dear. None of this is easy for you to digest, I'm most sure. We're telling you stuff that sounds so wacko, something so far-fetched, that you'd get out of a novel or something. It's not something people can easily believe is real, but these things are happening in our world and in our reality. You would be surprised what goes on out there. Of course, people keep a lid on it for fear of being ridiculed or made fun of. And I imagine you will likely do very much the same once we've sorted this mess out for you. You'll probably never speak of the matter again,
And I, for one, could never blame you for that. In the future this will seem like a bad dream, and you'll likely ask yourself, did this actually happen? We've been around your property, Mrs. Peterson. We found out exactly what is going on here, in this house of yours. It makes perfect sense to the both of us. I have encountered residual sadness left by the people living here in the Grey Lady, most especially the 2 grieving husbands who resided here, both who tragically lost their beloved wives to this dogman-like beast that Hawkeye has drawn for you. This creature is very physical, you know. It slips in and out of our dimension, as easily as taking a lift from the ground floor to the 5th, so to speak. Well, that's what it would be like for this insidious beast. This house, Mrs. Peterson, I'm trying to work out how to explain this to you more clearly, and its former melancholic residents have literally been feeding this dogman, unintentionally, of course, because this creature is interdimensional, as I was saying. He comes out of a portal in your woods, I believe, and he's been feeding off fear and grief for thousands of years. Once this house was built in the 1800s, it became a vital food source for him, as the energy of people's fear in this house was like a storehouse of pilchards for the beast. Believe me, he was always ravenously hungry, the kind of hunger that can never be satisfied no matter how much he eats. Of course he eats human and animal flesh, but most of his energy is sustained from something we call loosh, which is brought on by the adrenal charge or rush created by heightened terror and despair. You cannot physically see this loosh kind of energy, any more than you can see the signal from your own television set, but believe me, it is there. I don't know how to put this delicately, Mrs. Peterson, because it's very difficult to do so. But let's just say if the loosh was running out for the creature, he was about to have an increase in his supplies exponentially when you and your husband moved into the Grey Lady. You would be like a ship armed with new supplies docking at the port for the creature. You would likely have become his next abduction, Mrs. Peterson, and he'd have fed off your husband's despair, ensuring your husband did not leave the property, because he'd be so desperately trying to search for the creature in order to kill it. And in that way, the dogman would be feeding off your husband's despair. Mrs. Eleanor Bennet, who was the first legitimate owner of this property, Mrs. Peterson, tells me she was your great-great-grandmother, down the line or so. She was the one who guided you here to help close that portal in the woods. I think if you check your family genealogy, you will find this to be very accurate, which is why you were drawn to purchasing the property. Any crying you've heard in the property literally comes from Eleanor Bennet. She's revealed this to me. It's residual energy. She used to cry a lot because she was afraid of that dreadful beast in the woodgrove grabbing her. She knew he would eventually abduct her at some point in time. You're right about the creature, said Paul Benelodge. Both of my workmen discovered his nest in the woods. One of my workmen physically saw the beast, and what he describes fits the picture of what Hawkeye here has drawn. So how do we proceed from here? I asked Yvonne MacLeod. How do we get rid of this dogman? Can we actually get rid of him? I mean, what about this portal you're speaking about? How do we stop the dogman from slipping into our dimension again? And how do we get him back into the portal? Very good, Mrs. Peterson. That is exactly what needs to happen. We need to send the dogman back to where he comes from. We're going to have to ask the both of you to leave this property in our charge for a couple of days, while me and Hawkeye close the portal for you with our cleansing ceremonies. We will bless the place, and Hawkeye will call on a guardian of the forest to protect the portal, so that it is permanently closed, and that the beast is sent back to its dimension, where it needs to stay. Believe me, Mrs. Peterson, when you return to the Grey Lady, after the house is cleansed and the portal closed, you will barely recognize this place. I can assure you of that. I thanked Yvonne MacLeod and Hawkeye, the Native American shaman, who hadn't said a word to me since we'd met, apart from drawing his pictures. I assumed that, like most spiritual men, he was probably very quiet. I was wondering whether the cleansing ceremony would actually work. But Yvonne McLeod and Hawkeye seemed to know exactly what they were doing. I decided to put my trust in them, and when they informed me the ceremony was complete, I returned to the Grey Lady, wondering what I would find. Would the house feel any different for me? I drove down the drive and got out of my car. I gawked as I stared at the Grey Lady, in abject bewilderment, as if viewing her for the very first time in my life. I didn't even notice the psychic or Hawkeye walking towards me, as I was so caught up in the moment, so astonished by what I was beholding. Was this really the same house I had bought a while back? It couldn't be. There was no way. But it was the Grey Lady, who had risen from her melancholic slumber like a phoenix from the ashes. The Grey Lady had never looked more beautiful, more beguiling, more prepossessing. The heavy, dark, brooding energy that had clung around the house for so long, tarnishing her like a blackened piece of silver that had not been polished in years. It was as if the house had stepped out of a dark abyss, been wiped clean from its black, foggy mildew, and buffed up with a cleaning cloth. Now the light had magnanimously been invited in, where in the past an all-encompassing darkness occupied the space. I noticed the once wary sunshine that had been reluctant to cast its prisms over the house, now showered the Grey Lady in golden prisms of warm light. I could swear in that moment the house was actually smiling at me, and almost whispering in my ear, "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, thank you." "So what do you think of the Grey Lady, Mrs. Peterson?" asked Yvonne McLeod. "Do you recognise her at all? I bet you don't." "Barely," I said, tears filling my eyes and spilling down my cheeks. "I don't understand. How did you do it? She looks so beautiful. She doesn't look melancholic anymore. It's incredible." "But why are you crying then? You believed in this place when nobody else did. She's been saved. The heavy energy has gone for good." I threw my arms around Yvonne McLeod. "Thank you, thank you. Can you be sure the portal will not open again? That's the only thing that concerns me a little." "And you ask a very good question." Yvonne nodded to Hawkeye, who presented me with a picture he'd drawn. I stared at it agog. "This looks like a Bigfoot, with a human face. Is that what you've drawn?" I asked, studying the picture curiously. "What's this got to do with the portal?" For the first time Hawkeye spoke. He pointed to the picture he'd drawn. "His name is Danu," he told me. "He is the keeper of the forest. I called him here to guard the portal for you. You will be safe now." "Are you telling me a Bigfoot is actually guarding the portal in the woods?" I asked. The shaman nodded. "His name is Danu. It means gateway keeper." 1 month later. I know you're going to think I'm incredibly horrible, and you're probably right, I am. I didn't want to tell my husband Roland what had been going on with the Grey Lady, so he'd been kept in the dark about recent developments. I hadn't told him about how the heaviness over the property had been lifted. To all intents and purposes, when he'd seen the Grey Lady for the first time, I knew he thought he was staring at a nightmare that could never ever be salvaged. He believed that no matter what alterations were made on the Grey Lady, that she would always exude a very negative, dark, oppressive energy. It had been wonderful to see how Paul Benelodge's own workers had responded when they saw the Grey Lady again. They were astounded by the transformation, for the house seemed lighter, airier, and happier. I even called the estate agent over to view the place when it was fully completed to gauge his personal reaction. He shook his head in confoundment, and bemused he said, "Well, I never. How the hell did you change this house? It was one of the most miserable houses I have ever beheld, but now it looks spectacular, warmly welcoming. You do realise, Mrs. Peterson, that if the house you bought from our agents had looked like this when you purchased it, you would have paid a sizable fortune for the property. You saw its potential when no one else clearly did, and I applaud you greatly for that. Let's just say, Mrs. Peterson, if I had the Grey Lady up on my window now, offers would be flying into our offices like a flurry of autumn leaves." Hats off to you, Mrs. Peterson, for accomplishing the near impossible.
I could tell when I was due to take Roland to see the Grey Lady. He was deliberately procrastinating like a kid who doesn't want to go to school and is feigning a headache. Let's just say on that morning he complained of an upset stomach. First he couldn't find his eyeglasses, he couldn't find his car keys, and finally he conveniently forgot to fill up his truck with gas. Believe me, my husband was stalling like someone putting off a dental appointment for as long as possible. I knew he was dreading seeing his future home, and I hate to say this, but I was enjoying his discomfort. I knew he was in for the surprise of his life, and he had no comprehension how much the Grey Lady had changed, and I knew he would love the transformation.
"Sweetheart,"
he said to me, when we were driving to the property. I could see he was holding the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. He was certainly not looking forward to this.
"What if I don't like the Grey Lady, and everything you've done to the place?" he asked me gingerly. "What then?"
"We're moving into the Grey Lady," I told him, "whether you like it or not, Roland. Remember, you let me choose our new home. I promise you, you're not going to be disappointed." My husband appeared to be trembling as we began to approach the Grey Lady, and when we reached the house my husband parked his car and peered out of the windscreen. He let out an audible gasp, climbing out of the truck as he stared at the property in wondrous awe.
"Lizelle," he said, shaking his head, "there is no way that this is the same house you brought me to a few months back. It can't be the same place. This place is beautiful."
"So you could imagine living here then?" I teased.
"Of course I could. This is incredible. I'm in shock. What did you do to the place?"
he asked me incredulously. "I gave the house some tender loving care," I teased. 12 years later, Bobby's account. "My name is Bobby Peterson. I'm 10 years old. I live in the Grey Lady with my mum and dad. My best friend is called Joshua Ferris. He plays at my house very often. We love playing in the wood groves on the property, as there's so much to do in there. We play lots of games outside. My mum does not like me to be cooped up indoors all the time. She says it's bad for kids not to play out in nature, and that too many children are addicted to computer games these days. She doesn't want me to become like one of them. One day me and Joshua were walking through the trees, kicking up dirt, lifting up stones to see what bug we could find lying beneath the stones. That was when we heard a strange, deep humming sound. It wasn't mechanical. It was like a human humming sound. I think I've heard the sounds on television coming from monks before. The whole woods seemed to vibrate with the sound, as everything became brighter. The woods seemed to almost glow. It was like the ferns in the woods, and the trees seemed greener, as if the humming was affecting the colours around us, as strange as that may sound. My friend Joshua was surprised by the humming. He told me someone was on our land, and maybe we should go back and tell my mum, because they were obviously trespassing on private property, because they shouldn't be here. The humming got louder. We knew the person that was humming was walking towards us, so we hurriedly hid behind a tree in the wood grove to see who was coming. I realized they must be very big, because their feet made a booming sound, like if you're hitting a drum very hard. I could hear twigs cracking, leaves crunching. I remember my heart was thumping in my chest very hard. I wasn't scared. I was curious, but I could tell that Joshua was more scared than I was. He's never been brave. I'm the one that's brave out of the two of us. That was when we saw a big ponderous figure walking through the trees, and as it walked in our direction, it was humming this tune. And that was when I realized I was seeing a Bigfoot. Me and Joshua looked at each other, and then back again at the Bigfoot. We couldn't believe what we were actually seeing. This Bigfoot was very big, with a mighty, powerful body. He was covered in long, flowing black hair. Joshua and I remained incredibly still, but that was when the Bigfoot stopped, and he looked in the direction of where we were hiding. And that was when I actually got scared.
I felt so small, like a bug you could easily squash beneath your feet. The Bigfoot was so big, you see. I didn't know if it would hurt us, but I knew it could sense we were there. I wanted to run away, but my body just froze to the spot. And then he looked down at the both of us when he walked over to us. Then I found myself staring into his brown eyes. They were so kind. It was in that moment I knew I had nothing to fear. The Bigfoot spoke to me. His voice was so masterful, but his language was not one I understood. But when I listened to him, the English words popped into my head like magic.
"Hello, young man. I'm very pleased to finally meet you. I have a message you need to convey to your mother. Do you think you can give it to her for me on my behalf?"
"Sure," I said, nodding.
"Tell her I'm the guardian of the forest, that I have managed to close the portal permanently. It will never be opened again. The creature that caused so much trouble to your kind in the past can never ever come back. He is trapped in his time-space for good. I will be back every few months to check on this place for you. But I assure you, all is well."
Then he just glided away, and we heard him humming again, until it grew fainter. When we got home, we drew a picture of the Bigfoot for my mother, and we gave her the message, and she said,
Well, I never. Well, I never.
So there you are. That's my story.
Isn't that an incredible story? Wow, what an amazing story. I loved every minute of it. And how fascinating that this dog man was causing so much trouble on the land. And the moment they eliminated him, the light came on in the Grey Lady. How extraordinary was that? Until next time, goodbye and good night.